Shelagh, very welcome. Thanks for making the time in your busy schedule. You have been the chair of an EU-funded project, and it's called Farmers' Pride.
Yes.
Can you explain in a nutshell what that project entailed?
Yes, so thank you very much, Marcel, for the invitation to this interview. So, in fact, I was the project manager of Farmers' Pride. And Farmers' Pride, which has just recently concluded, was an EU-funded project, funded under the Horizon 2020 framework programme. And it's built on a number of previous EU-funded projects and other projects and initiatives from different funding sources, in which we've been developing our knowledge of in-situ or plant genetic resources in situ and approaches to their management with genetic diversity conservation objectives. And it's very strongly, the project's been very strongly linked with the in-situ and on-farm working groups of ECPGR, that's the European Cooperative Programme for Plant Genetic Resources. Mm-hmm. And ultimately in the project, what we were aiming for was to actually establish a network for in-situ plant genetic resources conservation and sustainable use across Europe. So a system for plant genetic resources conservation in situ, in the form of a network of plant populations and stakeholders. And the rationale for this is twofold. One is the increase in demand for diversity for crop improvement, and at the same time, the erosion of the very diversity that's needed.
Mm-hmm. So if you speak about erosion, how bad is it?
It's very bad. And as everybody knows, we're in this kind of biodiversity crisis at the moment, this extinction crisis, whatever you want to call it. And of course, that includes plant genetic resources. And the plant genetic resources that we're interested in that have the greatest diversity are crop wild relatives, so the species that are more or less closely related to crops and more easy to use in conventional plant breeding. And land races or farmers' varieties. Those are the diverse varieties that may have or typically have adaptations to local environmental conditions. And we know a lot about crop wild relatives because they're wild species. We have floras of countries. A lot of countries have very in-depth knowledge of the wild plant diversity. And we know through particularly undertaking red list assessments, so these are threat assessments using the methodology of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, IUCN. Mm-hmm. We did a study, which in fact I presented earlier today, back in 2009. And it's quite alarming, actually, the proportion of crop wild relative species. So these are wild relatives of very highly economically important crops in Europe. Very high proportion of the wild gene pools related to those crops are threatened. So they're either critically endangered, or they're vulnerable. Mm. For land races, it's not so easy to quantify because whereas crop wild relatives tend to keep their feet in the ground, they tend to be in one place. They don't move around very much. Land races are exchanged, they move with people. But there is a lot of evidence, plenty of evidence that we've lost a lot of landrace diversity, say probably over the last kind of 50 to 70 years. And one of the reasons for that is often that they're tend to be cultivated by the older generation. And then they're not passed on to the younger generation who are moving away from agriculture, unfortunately. Also, missing markets, lack of market opportunities is often difficult for the farmers. They need some income from continuing to cultivate them. And of course, they may be low yielding as well. So they may not be viable for them to continue to cultivate. So, but yes, we are in a serious crisis in terms of erosion of genetic resources, plant genetic resources.
Earlier on, you mentioned in-situ conservation. I'm familiar with ex-situ in gene banks, for example. Can you explain briefly what is in-situ conservation?
Okay, so in-situ conservation is basically managing, when we talk about plant genetic resources, managing plant populations in their natural environment in the case of crop wild relatives. So these are just wild species that are related. Obviously, some of them are the ancestors of our crops. So we still have some of those species, which were originally 10,000 years ago brought in from the wild and then brought in domesticated. And, well, we all know the story of wheat. In the case of, so it's a case of managing those populations in their natural environments, wherever that may be. Could be, they occur in all types of habitats. For land races or farmers' varieties, it's about managing those cultivated populations on the farm. We call it on farm. Sometimes people, in terms of the definition of in-situ conservation of the CBD, well, that's the Convention on Biological Diversity, in-situ included on-farm and wild plants. But there has been a dichotomy over the years that some people refer to in-situ just referring to wild species and on-farm as a separate. But in my view, they are both in-situ conservation.
So why is it so important that we do that in-situ conservation?
Well, as I said, there's an increasing need for diversity, for crop improvement, particularly in response to climate change. The environments in which crops are being cultivated are changing very rapidly in response to the climatic changes. Plant breeders are looking for more diverse traits all the time. Obviously, depending on the crop. It tends to be a greater use of these types of exotic traits in some crops more than others. But there is a real need for this diversity. You can only maintain that diversity effectively in situ. As soon as you take a sample of a plant population and place it into a gene bank ex situ, that's just a snapshot of diversity in time. You would have to keep going back every so many years. Obviously, the plant populations are adapting all the time to the changes in environmental conditions. The rate of that change will vary, of course, according to the biology of the species. But it's really important to conserve that constantly evolving adaptation that's going on in situ.
Okay, now that makes sense. But what I also understand is that those land racers and farmers' varieties, they often have a lower yield. Yeah. So how do you convince a farmer that it's still in his best interest to grow those varieties?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. But I think what we're effectively as a community working on is through education. It's through educating farmers and other growers about the value of those land races in terms of conservation of biodiversity, even that on its own, because they are part of biodiversity. We are in this biodiversity crisis. People are much more aware about the importance of biodiversity. So that in itself is a very good incentive to cultivate them. But then also, yes, you're right, some land races may have low yield, but they do have other qualities. So, for example, they can have important nutritional qualities, abiotic stress tolerances. They may be used more readily in organic farming. And of course, some farmers will continue anyway to grow land races just for their traditional value, or maybe particular culinary uses or for their taste.
So, Shelagh, besides your work in Farmers' Pride, you're also the chair of the genetic resources section of Carpia. And when we talk about genetic resources, I sometimes have the feeling that plant breeders are having trouble getting enough genetic resources. What's your take on that?
Well, I think, I've spoken to different plant breeders, and some plant breeders will say, actually, we've got enough diversity in our collections. But you don't know what types, they don't know, or we don't know. Nobody knows what's going to happen in 20, 30, 50 years' time, what kind of traits are going to be needed. And I think a long view is needed. So, I mean, obviously plant breeders, we know that plant breeders are going to gene banks to obtain material, so the demand is there, but we also know that they do need more diverse sources of genetic material. So, because of these changes in this more long-term view, we don't know whether gene banks are going to have the diversity that's needed in the future. So that's why we need this more complementary approach involving in-situ and ex-situ conservation to increase the diversity that's available to plant breeders.
This is, of course, a very specialistic topic, and I wonder whether policymakers really understand it. Do you have the feeling there is a fertile policy environment out there?
Yeah, the policy, well, in a one-word answer really is no, in a sense. I mean, there is a policy environment, but it's the actual implementation of that policy, which is often the case. That's the problem. So at global level, we have various policies and legislative instruments that are relevant to plant genetic resources conservation and sustainable use. So we have the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture. We have the second Global Plan of Action, which is under the FAO Commission on Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture. We have also the Convention on Biological Diversity aspects of that, targets of that are relevant, and specific targets under the Sustainable Development Goals. But in Europe, for example, the EU does not have a means of actually implementing those global commitments to those global agreements. And in another EU-funded project, which is nearing an end, that the University of Birmingham has been involved in, called GenRes Bridge, also funded by the Horizon 2020 framework program, we've been developing a European genetic resources strategy. And this will be, it's basically an overarching policy document, which is kind of similar, in a similar format to the Farm to Fork strategy and the biodiversity strategy. And we need that to fill a gap, because the policy environment in Europe probably it's quite similar in other parts of the world, but you have different policy areas that are dependent on genetic resources or have an impact on their conservation and sustainable use. So you've got agriculture, you've got environment, you've got health and food safety, but there's a gap where genetic resources are not being adequately addressed. And so there is a kind of fertile, going back to your question, there is a kind of fertile environment at global level, but certainly in Europe, more needs to be done. Also, of course, it's up to the countries to implement these global agreements. And of course, they have their national biodiversity strategies. Some countries have national plant genetic resources strategies or even crop wild relative strategies. But the progress has been rather slow in actually implement. It's okay to have a piece of paper with a nice document saying we need to do this, this, and this. The progress is still quite slow in actually implementing them.
It is incredibly important work, what you're doing. As a plant breeder myself, I realize the importance of having enough diversity for the creation of new and better varieties. What do you find the most satisfying of your work?
Well, for me personally, actually, it's connecting people. I mean, I'm someone that I have a lot of different hats. You know, I do project management, I do research, I'm involved in Carpia. I'm editor-in-chief of a journal on plant genetic resources characterization and utilization. I very rarely say no to anything. But I enjoy being in this kind of unique position of not being. I mean, I don't sort of sit in a lab in a university and work on one plant species. I couldn't do that. But I love the fact that I'm involved in the larger world, and in these various projects that I've been managing, we've had such a diversity of stakeholders, and particularly latterly in the Farmers' Pride project, to have the opportunity to get together with those stakeholders and understand the different perspectives and needs. And I feel really privileged to come to a congress like this, Euroseeds, and also to go to Eucarpia events. So I'm actually really getting an insight into the user community, which effectively us as conservationists are serving. So for me, it's obviously the research side as well, or the products from the projects that we do. I mean, I'm incredibly proud of the Farmers Pride project. We've done an enormous amount with not that much money actually in this project. People have worked really, really hard because we are all passionate about it. But it's the people for me. It's the importance of bringing people together. And I love doing that. I love organizing meetings and conferences and just generally sort of coordinating and having an overview.
You mentioned people, you mentioned congresses. We're here at the Euroseeds Congress in Prague. And for most people, including myself, it's the first big event that we are attending after COVID.
Yes.
What would you say is the one positive thing that you took from the COVID crisis?
Well, I mean, it goes back, I think, to people coming together, which is just what I was talking about. Mm-hmm. Because I don't know about, where you live, but certainly in the UK, the sense of community was very, very strong. Yeah. Unfortunately, the vaccination program has then divided people. Mm. But I think also in terms of the work that we do, and usually traveling a lot to different conferences and meetings, mm-hmm. I mean, it really made me, at first I was thinking, this is quite nice to have a bit of a break from traveling. But after a few months, I was really, really missing it. And so for me, this is also my first, I had a meeting last week just in the UK. It's really made me appreciate the importance of getting together. I mean, obviously there's an environmental downside to everybody flying somewhere. But when you're in a meeting like this, and I gave a presentation in the Euroseeds virtual congress last year, and and we had our final conference of the Farmers Pride project, and it was also the Eucarpia genetic, it was also section meeting at the same time. Mm-hmm. It's all online, and you don't have this interaction with people as you're walking through the lobby or over lunch mm-hmm. or over a drink, and that is so important, so important. Yeah.
Thank you, Shelagh.
Thank you very much, Marcel.